All right, everyone. Hello and welcome in. And like I said, or welcome back if you joined us last week. This is Focus Friday, and I'm super excited to be here with you again. I'm Tiffany MacLennan, a senior research associate here at Higher Education Strategy Associates, and your host for this series. In the series, what we're trying to do is basically just give a place and space to come hang out, learn things, have a conversation, make new friends from across the country, and solve the problems together. Um, our first session, like I said, was 2 weeks ago. We were joined by Jackie Pichette and Sunny Chan from RBC and Business Higher Education Roundtable, respectively, and we started talking about what does the future of post-secondary education look like. Big question, definitely not particularly a focused one to start off Focus Friday, but I think the conversation overall was pretty great. The email that you should have received this morning gives a highlight of that conversation. And if you didn't receive it, get in touch with me afterwards and I'll make sure that we can get you on the mailing list so that you get a copy. You probably have noticed when you registered for this session that you were asked, what is a topic that you would like to see in the future? What is something that you're interested in during this topic? And one of the things that came up way more than I expected, actually, was how do we talk and think about the student experience? How do we navigate creating an environment that is interesting, appealing, and relevant to our students? And then, more interestingly, how do we measure it? And how do we actually assess what the student experience is and how we move through it? So to help us unpack that, I have a all-star lineup for you folks today, which I'm super excited about. And I'm joined by three people who I think see the student experience from very different but very important angles. So first we have Wasiimah Joomun, the Executive Director of the Canadian Alliance of Students Association, which represents students from colleges, polytechnics, universities, and graduate students from across the country. Brendan Roberts, Executive Director of Students Nova Scotia, which is basically a provincial equivalent of CASA. And we also have Olamipo Ogunnote. Close, I messed it up. I got nervous that time. Director of Advocacy and Strategic Partnerships at Ontario Student Voices, which represents students in Ontario's college sector. So we have a good spread from across the country, but also across our different types of polytechnics, universities, and colleges today. One of the things that I did kind of want to caveat here is that one of the first things I'm sure one of you at least are thinking, because it has come up in the comments, is, well, is a student leadership perspective, relevant to the overall conversations on campuses? And having been a former student leader myself, I would say that, there's definitely differences between a student leader student experience and your common student experience. For the most part, student leaders and former student leaders who have become leaders of these organizations are a little bit more connected, a little bit more informed than your average student. But on the flip side of that, I think student leaders in particular have an incredibly unique vantage point because we spend a lot of time talking to students. We spend a lot of time listening to students, and we do it as peers and as professions. So I think that these three people, me and my past life, and really all your student leaders on your campuses, have some incredibly valuable insights that maybe we don't always get in our everyday conversation. So that was a lot of intro. I'm going to start us off with questions. All three of us, are we ready? Fantastic. I'm going to start with a question for all of you and go Wasiimah, Brendan, Olami. And my first question for you folks is, when you think about the student experience right now, from the perspectives that you represent, what's one thing that you feel is the most different about being a student today compared to when you even started your own higher education journey? Wasiimah, start with you.
Perfect. Thank you, Tiffany, for having us for this important conversation, because I always like to say that in this conversation, often the student voices or the student experiences is not around the table. And as someone who's been in student advocacy for about 9 years, I would say, I went to university in New Brunswick, a small institution, St. Thomas University. And this question really got me reflecting about, because as you very nicely put in the intro, Tiffany. As someone who's been involved in student leaders, like to go back to when I first started my journey in post-secondary and why I had chosen post-secondary too. I think like this question can go so many different ways. But like the point that I'm gonna talk a little bit about it is like having a conversation about what do we mean by student experience? Are we all in the same understanding what student experience is? I feel like student experience people think is like what is on campus, but it's also like the benefit that you get outside of campus. But when I was thinking really about this, one big difference I saw when I joined in like post-secondary to now is I think coupled with like financial burden, but also with social pressures, there is students are not doing post-secondary education as like to explore their interests. I feel like nowadays people are joining post-secondary education as like trying to match what the labor market needs. But I think there needs to be a bigger conversation about is the workforce allowing for students to implement their skills? I think there's always a bigger conversation, and we'll go a little bit more into deep into that, and I'm really excited for it. But is education worth it? But I think we need to also flip the narrative around, do people see the value of education? Are we meeting students in the middle from what they are learning on the ground? Because I feel like, as you mentioned, like students, one thing I also noticed, and this is driving from last month, my team and I traveled across the country, across 22 campuses. We talked to about thousands of students collectively on the ground. So those are not student leaders, those are students who are joining post-secondary education with back to school. And students are definitely more connected than they used to when I first started. They do care nationally, they do care globally, but I also feel like it's like an outcome of how they need to be connected. I remember when I joined post-secondary and like my first class, I did like a journalism class because I was like, I would like to know if this is something that's of interest to me. Found out it's not of interest for me, but I feel like I had room to explore what I wanted. But I feel like nowadays, like students are just very much like, we need to go to school to get a job to do this, but then the system is not preparing them for that. But also, it's not just about the system, but it's like how the government or the institution also value the student experience and what they're getting on the ground. So, and one piece I also got, and I feel like there's a lot of institution around the table here as well too, is I think institutions should also be believing into what they're selling to students. I feel like nowadays we are having conversation about like students in silos, government in silos, institution in silos, and I feel like there's like a disbelief and like somehow the blame has been put on students for a system they didn't even create. That's a system they are entering in. So I feel like there needs to be a bigger conversation between like the government and institution about, yes, we are saying that like we're trying to match labor market needs, but like are the labor market needs matching what students are learning in curriculum? Why are we only talking about changing the curriculum, but not on the other side as well too? So I would say like for me, that is like the biggest difference is like post-secondary education is feeling like a need, yes, but there is like that lack of like dreaming to explore what you want to do. Like for instance, I went to school for a liberal arts school, and because I just wanted to see what post-secondary education was, what was all the fuss about, and on paper right now, I wouldn't meet the criteria because I didn't learn any technical skills. I'm a critical thinker, I'm an advocate. I studied criminology and psychology, but now I'm leading an organization in post-secondary advocacy nationally. So my skills was transferred, but I think we need to, but if I were to go to post-secondary education now and get the same degree, I don't think I will be set up for success just the same way. So has the labor market also met the students in the middle for what they are learning? So I think there needs to be a shift in conversation that the system is failing, curriculum is not matching, students are not willing to learn, but also get on the other side and meet students in the middle. So that's where I'll end it. And then looking forward to continuing that conversation for the other questions.
Absolutely. And definitely a much more, less of a one-to-one relationship there and much more of a tangled web of challenges and solutions, is what I'm hearing. Brendan, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I agree with pretty much everything that Wasiimah said. And I think that there's a lot of similarities in the Nova Scotia context, specifically. I think that kind of what was just being talked about, the complexity of the system now, and the often conflicting priorities between government versus higher educational institutions makes for a very confusing system where students don't always have clear direction or a clear understanding of sort of what they're getting out of post-secondary. And I think that's probably the biggest difference. I started university here at St. Francis Xavier University in 2020. So right kind of on the onset of the pandemics, which was a very crazy time. And I think even since then, the level of complexity in the system overall has really sort of exploded. I also think that, you know, even in 2020, I think there was a lot of affordability challenges that students were thinking about. And I think that those, have not gotten any easier, whether that's housing, food insecurity is a really big one, especially in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is the most food insecure province in the country. And there's a lot of competing financial things that students have to think about when they're going into post-secondary that were still considerations 10, 20 years ago, but they're even more so now. Um, and I think that with that sort of wave of overwhelming factors that students need to consider, there's also a lot more anxiety that students are facing because of all of those things that they have to think about. So, it's not only now getting into post-secondary and what am I going to take, but it's also how am I going to afford to stay in post-secondary and try and graduate on time. I think I can't remember the exact statistic, but the average degree length time in Canada is now, I think it's like 4.7 years or something. It might be even higher now. And I think that that's pretty indicative of where priorities are. Students need to work part-time now to afford their education. So I think that a lot of that affordability is really playing into some anxiety for students nowadays. Um, and yeah, and I agree with what Wasiimah was saying, especially about kind of degree prospects or career prospects based on the degree that a student might choose. Government really wants a lot of the times across country, I know for sure here in Nova Scotia, want students to go into certain professions or into certain sectors, and there's a lot less wiggle room within programs, and even trying to maneuver within programs or just take something that you're interested in versus what's most economically stimulating. But yeah, so lots of different things could go on forever, I'm sure, but I'll leave it there for now.
Fantastic. Olami, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tiffany, for having me, and I'm happy to be here to talk to all of you today. I think that what's different now for students is that constant questioning of value. Much like what the rest of my colleagues have said, students are asking, well, if I'm paying this much and I'm taking on this much debt, is my program really going to lead to stability? And when I was in school, that doubt wasn't one that was as loud before. And now with the program closures happening across Ontario, that uncertainty is only deepened. The student experience has shifted from assuming that higher education is a guaranteed investment to constantly weighing every choice against a rising cost of living, an uncertain job market, and that the risk that their programs might not even be there by the time that they finish. And I think that we're seeing this play out in real ways. Several colleges have shut down programs, campuses are being closed, or even programs being canceled during orientation week. In cases like that, yeah, students are left wondering, well, if my college doesn't see value in offering me a program, does that mean that there's no value in the profession itself or no future job for me in it? And I think a last point I'd like to make to all of this is that there should be growing concern that the strategic mandate agreements, especially in Ontario, are steering institutions to only produce graduates tied to a government's short-term ideology. And that's something that I think Brendan was echoing, rather than preparing students for the full range of futures that they might imagine for themselves.
Absolutely. And I had the luxury of coming in and chatting with you guys earlier this summer about such agreements and kind of how they wiggle into what the student experience looks like, which was super, super exciting. Wasiimah, I'm going to pose two questions to you. We're going to walk through this with two questions from Wasiimah. For people who joined late, Wasiimah is the executive director of CASA, the basically the Federal Student Advocacy Association that has colleges, polytechnics, universities, and graduate students underneath it. Brendan is from Students Nova Scotia, which is basically a provincial equivalent, and Olami is from Ontario Student Voices, which is a similar organization for Ontario college students. So, Wasiimah, I'm going to point two questions for you. The first one, from your national vantage point, what do you see are the biggest drivers shaping what the student experience is across Canada right now. Yeah, that's it. That's the question.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tiffany. And I think we are all going to sound like a record, and you all agree, affordability. And I think the piece is like the financial pressures and affordability doesn't just exist in a vacuum. I think this is like the umbrella term that really just trickle down. And the cost of going to post-secondary education is not only tuition. It's the rising cost of everything: housing, food, transit, clothing, all the basic needs that we need. And actually, we did survey our students. We studied students across the country, actually, in 2024. So, and 40% of students have reported that they've skipped meal due to cost. 1 in 4 say they struggle to pay rent. 1 in 5 said they use food bank, and 4% of students have experienced homelessness. These are the people who are supposed to be the future. They're supposed to be learning the skills to get back into the economy, to be the future business owners, the future family, the future homeowners, and they are already struggling. So I think like that's why we are having this conversation, is like what is going to be next for the generation, for the country. And when I think affordability is something I think like Brendan and Olami will also touch upon, but like as I said, I visited all the campuses and people are saying they are having to choose whether they will go like buy a meal or buy a textbook. But that doesn't mean like, but these students still chose to do post-secondary education. And I feel like your next question, well, we will go into this, but like, why are students still choosing to do post-secondary education? Why they're still struggling? There still is an importance or value that students are seeing. But I think there is a bigger conversation about how do we address that affordability. And I think, and in full transparency, I feel like as a sector, we've kind of like looked at the international student program or at the other program to just kind of like try to scapegoat the answer. But I think it's just like we didn't match the true cost of living. I am not a student and I'm struggling to pay rent. If I was a student, I do not know how I would do it. So I think we didn't consider that like student will still experience the inflation cost that everyone else is experiencing, and somehow they are to be blamed for wanting to equip themselves to go back to the economy, to come back in the country to kind of help support. So and in terms of like choosing which one is, that's why I say the financial pressures like exist in a vacuum. They affect everything else. When most students I speak to, money is their number one source of stress, and that leads to mental health, that leads to decline in academic success. So if someone is struggling to figure out where to eat or they are skipping meals, how are we expecting them to go back into classroom and really like be able to support that? Or if you're going to bed worrying whether you'll be able to pay for your next fees for the next semester. And I feel like those numbers impact our international students the most as well too. Over 50% of them reported skipping meals to be able to go to post-secondary education. And this is a choice they made because they see the value of earning a degree. They understand this is what they need to do next to be able to set themselves up for success. But is the system setting them up for success? So I think there's like a bigger conversation about the institution and government matching the urgency of the need to be able to support them to be able to prosper accordingly.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Brendan, I'm going to jump right over to you with this one. We just got a little bit of the national picture, but you represent students on a more provincial level, which brings you sometimes a little bit closer to your students. And I think out of the three of you, you are also the most recent graduate. So congratulations, first of all, but also welcome to the other side. And you're going to have a ride. So my first question for you, you're very closely in touch, as I said, with campuses across Nova Scotia, where the sense of community is really strong, but resources can be extremely limited. What are students telling you that they feel they need to be most? What are students telling you they need to feel the most connected and supported at their institutions right now?
Yeah. First of all, yes, thank you for the call out. Yes, I am. I think the newest graduate. It's been very crazy the last couple months, finding a job and all that. But it's been exciting. So yeah, I think Nova Scotia has a fairly unique space where I think a lot of the universities, especially where there's a lot of smaller universities, there's a lot of rural universities, but even those that are, more central in Halifax, Nova Scotia is a smaller province, and I think that a lot of the university experience and even the college experience here is relies heavily on kind of those tight-knit communities. And, I think unsurprisingly, COVID threw a wrench in a lot of that. And I think that what universities administrators have been, really working hard towards, and student leaders as well, has been trying to think about how do we build back that community, but build it back in a way that supports the needs and wants of this new kind of generation of post-COVID students. Because I think that it looks very differently in terms of how we engage with students and try and interact with them. I think that, um, you know, a lot of the times universities, or rather administration tries to, implement new programming, or whether that's educational sessions or community building events, or even just, things that are for fun. Um, and I think that all that's done with the attempt to try and build a sense of community. But I think one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that you can't force, or you can't build a sense of community for people. They have to build that themselves. And I think a new way to kind of look at how do we build community is providing students with the tools and resources so that they can create their own communities. One of the things I try and say whenever I'm talking to people who are, struggling with student engagement is you can't build a community for someone, but you can give them the tools to foster it themselves. And I think that that's really important, as we're trying to navigate, how do we engage with students in sort of this new way. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there, but yeah.
Some good wisdom that is actually going to lead very well into my very next question for you. When we talk about new student services, new student offerings, connecting and building that sense of community, one of the biggest questions that hit my inbox this week was, well, how do we actually connect with this group of post COVID students? Not everyone reads their emails anymore. So, Brendan, what's your thoughts on communicating with students these days?
That it's funny you say that, because that was one of the first things I was going to say is don't rely on email. Um, I think, even though and I can say the same thing as a former student, even though we should be reading our emails, a lot of the times we don't, because there's so many and it's just not something that's always on your radar. Um, but I think, not to repeat myself, it's changed drastically since COVID, and I think we need to acknowledge that, but not dwell on it. And I think there's a really big opportunity now to sort of redefine what that relationships looks like. Um, and I think that it looks a lot like building bridges with student leaders, especially whether that's, your respective student association or student union at your institution. And I think utilizing them in a way to try and disseminate that important information, especially on, in my case, a lot of the schools that I represent are smaller. Word of mouth is oftentimes the way that things get around the fastest. And trying to get your student leaders on board with whatever it is that you're doing. And that doesn't always mean that you'll agree necessarily, but if you can at least come to a point where you can you can kind of reach a consensus on something and you can try and work it out that way, I think that's useful. But we also can't expect student leaders or students to align on every issue. And I think we need to provide meaningful space for direct collaboration, because at the end of the day, students are the subject matter experts in being students. And involving them in decision making will definitely lead to a better post-secondary system.
I do agree. Olami, colleges in Ontario this year have, had a bit of a tough time, as I'm sure you're hearing from students from all your student organizations. With funding challenges, policy uncertainties, so many students who are juggling work, parenting, different caregiving, responsibilities. How are those pressures shaping the student experiences in colleges right now?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I was chatting with a student last week who just finished an 8-hour shift and had to catch the bus, race home to get to her kids to take care of them. Her husband was helping out, and then had to start working on an assignment at midnight. And I think that kind of experience I just laid out is not one that's uncommon for a lot of students right now. Yes, I think our students are resilient, but I think that resiliency shouldn't just be about surviving hardship. It should be about how can we thrive with opportunity. And I think there's 4 key areas that we can look to try and tackle this. The first would be I think for college administrators, if there's any on the call today in our colleges, there's an opportunity here for you to be those leaders in your community, advocating for those changes that will make life more affordable for students. It's not just about where we can find more funding, though I do agree that that is important. It's about what policies can I speak to that will make life more affordable for students, because it is the biggest issue affecting them. I think the second point is we need to focus on where students are spending the majority of their time, and that's in the classroom. If that classroom environment isn't supportive, everything else that we do will only go so far. So that space should be, a space where they feel set up to succeed, and not where, the challenges that they face gets heavier. The third point I like to focus on is accessibility and empathy. When I talk to a lot of students, they keep mentioning that they need more flexible and accessible options. And I think that when we design learning in this way, it helps lighten the burden that they carry, and it gives them the space to actually focus on learning. And for professors here on this call today, if there's any, or those who work closely with them, students are really thankful for the small acts that you do that shows them that you care about their success. And then the last and final point I like to make is I think with all the policy changes that we're seeing, the campus closures, like I mentioned, the program cuts, the support staff layoffs, and now the strikes, there has never been a bigger need to safeguard and strengthen the supports mechanisms that we do have for students right now. They need stability, especially when everything else around them really does feel uncertain. I think if we focus on all those aspects, we'll do, a much stronger job of really strengthening that student experience.
I hope everyone heard that, and I would get you to say it twice because that was fantastic. My next question for you to stay with you. Students in colleges, often particularly, are more commuter, are more part-time, and like you said, have more of different commitments in their lives and their jobs, etc. How, what are you hearing about what helps or what's missing about connecting college students on campuses?
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing a lot is that we need to think about belonging in a different way. It needs to look different, especially with all the different ways students are accessing their campus communities. But most importantly, it's really starting with an understanding of their lives and where they are right now. For some students, it means that the networking and the access to opportunities that the colleges are providing them makes the toughness, I guess, of school feel a little bit more purposeful. And it shows them that their college community cares not just about what's happening in their classrooms, but also about the next phase of their lives, which is ultimately where they're focused at. I think for others, it's about whether we're meeting their real needs. They really care deeply about healthcare that they have on campus, the mental health, the food supports, the financial aid that they get. And unfortunately, it's these kind of supports that are often too underfunded or always under threat. And sometimes our student associations, I'll shout them out, are doing an amazing job to fill those gaps, but they can't do it alone, especially now when we're considering Bill 33 and some of the impacts that that could have on them. And so I think that when colleges are making these purposeful decisions to invest in these services, it's sending a really clear message that, you matter here, your challenges are seen, and you're not in this alone. And I think to help form a true community belonging, it's about thinking about that connection. It's about that care. I also hear from students about what's missing, and what's missing is that it's not necessarily the will to belong in the campus community. It's the time and space. The affordability is forcing them to think about survival before their community. And that really leaves them with little energy to engage in the very things that would make their college life meaningful. But saying that, to move to a more positive outcome, I think that even in those constraints, we're finding that students are finding a sense of belonging through WhatsApp groups. They meet informally a lot of the times to discuss their programs, their outcomes. And I think that it's in those informal relationships is where that sense of belonging often starts to take root. And again, I'm going to shout out our colleges. I want to praise some of them that really recognize that encourage that, and are celebrating students that are doing that, because they understand that real community isn't just formed in the classrooms. It's actually based on the everyday connections that students are making. Lastly, I will end with this point that a real sense of community never will come from the infographics that you put on your Instagram or the posters or anything in the handbook. It comes from when institutions are actually matching the reality of the lives that the students are facing. It comes from being a part of a place that recognizes them not just as learners, but as people with families, with jobs, and worries that oftentimes extend far beyond our campus corridors or our virtual classrooms. And I think that when we understand that reality, we're signaling to students that this place has done everything for me. So now I want to give everything I have back. And I think it's in that exchange that we have, in that mutual care that we show, that's when we start to form those real bonds that truly make a community.
Thank you so much. I have one question left for each of you. You get 1 minute to respond and you get only one answer. Are you ready? From your perspectives, what do you think is the top priority of students across Canadian campuses right now? Wasiimah, we'll start with you.
Choosing one is a hard one. As I was literally taking notes and then I remembered it was only one. But I think there needs to be having a bigger conversation. And I was actually pretty surprised when I talked to students directly on the ground, not even student leaders, that are looking and considering the funding model for post-secondary education in the country. I don't think there has been a bigger national conversation about what does the role of provincial and federal government looks like. And actually this year at CASA, we did a survey where working age Canadian, 89% of working age Canadian believe that the federal government should invest in post-secondary education. And about 79% of them believe that taxpayer funding should be used to help low-income students access post-secondary education. So I think there is currently a big narrative that people don't see the value of post-secondary education. But I feel like when you look at the stats, when you hear the stories, people do understand the value of attending post-secondary education. They do understand why it's important that you prepare the next generation. But I feel like institutions are trying to keep on the lights, students are trying to survive, but there's no actual support on the ground to really help support them. So if I had to choose one, there's so many I could choose, but if I had to choose one, I think there needs to be a bigger conversation about funding.
Brendan.
Like Wasiimah, picking one is a very difficult thing to do. But I think on a similar note, the cost of living, I think just affordability in general is another thing that's really top of mind for students. Because if you can't, pay for the gas to drive to school, if you can't pay for the food so that you have, a well-nourished brain to go to your studies, if you can't, just afford school in general, it makes accessing and staying in school very difficult. And that's where we see students, having to take on extra part-time work or even full-time work just so they can afford to graduate on time. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. In Nova Scotia specifically, student financial aid really hasn't increased, whether it's the weekly maximums or some of the other maximums that students can get. They haven't increased in, over a decade. And I think that stagnant rate is we're seeing the impact of it, especially when inflation's crept up so quickly. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Olami.
I will say affordability or anything related to that, as all my other colleagues have said, but I like to offer a slightly different perspective, which is what I'm also hearing a lot from students is on AI. And, the questions are, will AI replace my job? Which honestly is a valid and fair question. How can I use it effectively and responsibly? What skills will help me as my industry or industries evolve? Can we explore the ethical considerations? They're always asking this, and how can we understand not just how to use AI, but also how to lead responsibly with it? And I think what makes it complex within our institutions sometimes is that our professors or professors generally don't necessarily always want to hear about AI, and others fully embrace it. So there's this weird gap. I think that there's a challenge and opportunity there, which is in figuring out how we can balance some of those perspectives while ensuring that we're keeping our students ready for the world ahead of them. So generally, I think students don't want AI to be an afterthought. They want their institutions to equip them with the skills, the knowledge, the ethical grounding, the confidence to be able to use it meaningfully or not, as they go on in their post-secondary journey.